The airport was alive with movement. A swirling mass of hurried travelers, rolling luggage, and intercom announcements cutting through the air. In the midst of the organized chaos, Zara, a 16-year-old girl with bright, eager eyes, stood at the boarding gate, her heart thrumming with excitement. This was her first time traveling alone, a moment she had anticipated with both exhilaration and nervousness. She clutched her boarding pass and passport tightly, aware of the responsibility on her shoulders. Her father, a man who had always emphasized the importance of humility despite his success, had encouraged her to embrace every experience with grace and confidence. Yet, despite his lessons, an uneasy feeling gnawed at her, a whisper of apprehension she couldn't quite shake. Zara stepped forward, her turn arriving at the gate counter. She smiled at the flight attendant, a woman whose name tag read Gloria. The woman barely acknowledged her greeting, instead glancing at Zara with a cool, detached expression. Gloria's eyes flickered from Zara's face to her neatly styled braids, then down to the name on her boarding pass. Zara felt the weight of an unspoken judgment settle over her like a thick, invisible fog. Still, she remained polite, handing over her documents with steady hands. Gloria scanned the ticket, her brows furrowing. "Are you traveling alone?" she asked, her voice tinged with something that felt more like suspicion than curiosity. "Yes, ma'am," Zara replied, her voice measured. "I'm heading home after attending a leadership conference." A pause, a tightening of the lips. Gloria's gaze swept over her once more, the scrutiny in her expression intensifying. It was a look Zara knew too well, the kind she had encountered before from teachers who doubted her abilities, from store clerks who followed her movements a little too closely, from people who hesitated just a second longer before offering her the same respect given freely to others. Gloria pursed her lips. "This ticket doesn't look valid," she said flatly. Zara frowned, confusion stirring in her chest. "It's definitely valid. I confirmed everything earlier today." But Gloria shook her head, her voice growing louder. "I don't think so. It doesn't look right to me." A few nearby passengers turned their heads, their curiosity piqued by the exchange. Zara felt the slow, creeping sensation of embarrassment flood through her, burning at her skin. She forced herself to remain calm. "It was booked through my father's office," she explained carefully, unwilling to lose her composure. "Maybe you can scan it again?" Gloria let out a dismissive scoff, rolling her eyes as though she had heard this excuse 1,000 times before. And then, in one swift, shocking motion, she tore Zara's ticket in half. The sound of the paper ripping was louder than any boarding announcement, louder than the murmur of onlookers who gasped in surprise. Zara's breath caught in her throat. "What are you doing?" "That's my ticket." Gloria didn't flinch. She tossed the torn pieces onto the counter like discarded scraps. "Move along, little girl. You're not getting on this flight with a fraudulent ticket." For a moment, the world around Zara blurred. The stares of strangers, the murmurs of disapproval and intrigue, the heat rising in her cheeks, it all felt like a surreal nightmare. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the ruined ticket, staring at it in disbelief. She could feel the sting of injustice tightening around her chest, pressing down like a weight she couldn't shake. She could call her father. She could fix this, but why should she have to? Why should she be the one to prove herself? To fight for what was already rightfully hers? Taking a deep breath, she clenched the torn ticket in her fist. No matter how much she wanted to shrink away, she wouldn't. She wouldn't let this moment define her. The moment Zara pressed the call button, her heart pounded like a drum. Each ring seemed to stretch endlessly. And with every second that passed, the humiliation of what had just happened settled deeper into her bones. She gripped the torn halves of her ticket, feeling the raw edges beneath her fingertips, evidence of an injustice so blatant, so unwarranted, that it made her stomach twist. And then, finally, on the second ring, her father's voice came through. "Zara?" His voice was steady but tinged with concern. "You should be boarding soon." Zara inhaled sharply, forcing herself to keep her voice even. "Dad, there's a problem." A pause. "They won't let me board." Silence. A silence so thick that for a moment, Zara thought the call had dropped. But then, his voice came again, low and controlled. "What do you mean they won't let you board?" "The flight attendant, Gloria, she said my ticket wasn't valid." Zara said, the words tumbling out as the weight of the incident pressed on her. She tore it up. Right in front of me. Told me to move along, like I didn't belong here. Another stretch of silence. But this one was different. This one was cold. Zara had never been afraid of her father's silence before. But she knew what it meant. She knew the kind of man he was. The kind who built his empire not with arrogance, but with precision. The kind who rarely had to raise his voice, because his presence alone carried weight. He was the man who negotiated billion-dollar deals with a single, carefully worded sentence. A man who had spent his life ensuring fairness in an industry where money often dictated worth. But most importantly, he was a father who had taught his daughter to hold her head high, even in the face of adversity. But today was different. Where are you right now? He asked. His voice measured, controlled. Zara swallowed. Near the gate. She acted like I wasn't supposed to be here. Dad, I'll be there soon. His words were final, absolute, a promise. And then the call ended. Zara exhaled, her hands trembling as she lowered the phone. She could still feel the weight of the passengers' stares, the quiet pity in some, the indifferent avoidance in others. Her fingers curled around the torn ticket, her nails pressing into the paper. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not now. Somewhere across the country, Nathaniel Pierce, CEO of one of the largest airlines in the world, pushed back from his sleek mahogany desk. The skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. But he didn't see it. He didn't see anything but red. It wasn't the first time he had heard of discrimination in the industry. But this time, it was his daughter. The drive to the airport felt longer than it should have. His driver, sensing the storm brewing in his employer's silence, didn't ask questions. The moment they arrived, Nathaniel stepped out of the black company car and strode through the terminal with purpose. Heads turned as he passed, employees catching a glimpse of the man whose name was printed on their paychecks. Some whispered, nudging each other in hushed recognition. Zara saw him before he saw her. The instant her father entered the terminal, a shift happened. It was as though the very air thickened. The quiet hum of the airport pressing in as people instinctively straightened. Power had arrived. He found her near the gate. And for the first time since the incident, her composure wavered. He wasn't just her father right now. He was a force, a presence so commanding that the gate agents stiffened, exchanging nervous glances as he approached. He stopped in front of her, his gaze scanning her face. Are you all right? His voice was softer than she expected. Zara nodded, but the way she clutched the torn ticket betrayed her. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, as if reining in a storm inside him. Then, he turned, his eyes locking onto the nearest airline employee. Get me the supervisor on duty. The man didn't hesitate, disappearing into the crowd like a soldier following an unspoken order. Within moments, Richard, the terminal supervisor, arrived, his face already lined with worry. Mr. Pierce, sir. Nathaniel's stare cut through him. Tell me exactly what happened to my daughter. Richard swallowed hard, his gaze flickering to Zara. He looked at the torn ticket in her hand, then back at Nathaniel. He knew. They all knew. Sir, I sincerely apologize. If I had known. Nathaniel's expression darkened. You shouldn't have to know who she is to treat her with basic decency. Silence. And then, a figure stepped forward, Gloria. For the first time since the incident, Zara met her eyes, and for the first time, Gloria looked afraid. I was just trying to, she stammered. But Nathaniel wasn't interested in excuses. You tore up a valid ticket, he said, voice like steel. You humiliated a passenger in front of dozens of witnesses. And when she tried to explain herself, you dismissed her. His tone remained eerily calm, but there was an edge to it that could cut glass. Gloria fidgeted. Sir, I thought. You thought wrong. The finality in his voice sent a shiver through the small crowd that had gathered. Nathaniel turned to Richard. I trust you'll handle this? Richard nodded quickly. Effective immediately. She's suspended. We'll conduct a formal review. Nathaniel's gaze lingered on Gloria for a moment longer before he turned back to Zara. Come. She followed without hesitation. By the time they reached a quieter section of the terminal, Zara finally exhaled. Dad? He looked at her. Yes? She hesitated, then met his gaze, her voice quiet but unwavering. I don't want this to just be about me. This happens to people all the time. Something flickered in his expression, something proud. Then let's make sure it doesn't keep happening, he said simply. And just like that, a fire was lit. This wasn't just about one flight attendant. This was about change. Zara sat beside her father in the private meeting room, her fingers gripping the armrest of her chair. The events of the past hour had unraveled like a surreal nightmare, her humiliation at the gate, her father's powerful arrival, and now, the tense silence that filled the small office where airline management had gathered. Across from them sat Richard, the terminal supervisor, along with Gloria, who now looked nothing like the confident, dismissive woman who had torn up Zara's ticket. She looked nervous. Her hands trembled slightly where they rested in her lap, and her face was pale, her jaw set in a tight line. For all the arrogance she had displayed before, she had not expected this. Mr. Pierce, I assure you, I was just following protocol. Gloria stammered, her voice thinner than before, lacking the sharp edge she had used on Zara. Nathaniel Pierce's gaze was unwavering, his presence as commanding in the quiet meeting room as it had been in the bustling terminal. Zara could tell he was measuring his words, his patience stretched to its limit. Protocol? He echoed, his voice a low, dangerous calm. Which part of your protocol involves ripping up a paying passenger's ticket and humiliating her in front of dozens of people? Gloria's mouth opened, but no words came. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sir, I want to personally apologize on behalf of the airline. This is unacceptable behavior, and I assure you, we will take the necessary steps. This isn't just about an apology. Nathaniel interrupted, his tone sharper now. This is about accountability. Zara watched Gloria, trying to understand what the woman was feeling. Was it regret, embarrassment, or just fear of losing her job? She wasn't sure. Zara wasn't cruel, but she was still angry. She had spent her whole life hearing her father's warnings about how some people would judge her before they even knew her, how they would dismiss her, make her feel like she didn't belong. She had tried to believe the world was better than that. But today, Gloria had proven her father right. And the worst part? This wasn't just about her. She wasn't the first person Gloria had treated this way. And if no one stopped her, she wouldn't be the last. Richard cleared his throat, glancing between Nathaniel and Gloria before speaking carefully. We will launch a formal internal review immediately. But, Mr. Pierce, I want you to know that we take these matters very seriously. Miss, he turned to Zara, hesitating, as if realizing for the first time that she wasn't just a child but a passenger who had been deeply wronged. Miss Pierce, I understand this must have been humiliating for you, and I can assure you that disciplinary action will be taken. Zara's voice was steady when she finally spoke. What happens next? Richard hesitated again. Gloria will be placed on immediate unpaid suspension while we conduct a review. Gloria let out a breath, relief flashing across her face. It was short-lived. Nathaniel leaned forward, his gaze steady. And what exactly will that review entail? Richard hesitated again. We will conduct interviews, go over passenger complaints, and review any prior incidents. Prior incidents? Nathaniel's voice darkened. So, you're saying this isn't the first time? Gloria stiffened. Richard's face turned red. Sir, I can't discuss personnel matters in detail. But, he exhaled, clearly feeling the weight of the conversation. There have been complaints before. Nothing officially documented beyond minor infractions. But enough to suggest a pattern. Nathaniel finished for him. The room fell silent again. Gloria clenched her hands in her lap, her knuckles white. She knew this wasn't just about today. This was about all the times she had let her biases dictate how she treated people. Mr. Pierce, I understand if you want to escalate this matter, Richard said carefully, but I assure you, we take this very seriously. If we find that Gloria has violated the company's policies, further action will be taken. Nathaniel glanced at Zara. She had remained quiet, but he could see the emotions warring in her: anger, sadness, exhaustion. He could have pushed harder, demanded immediate termination, but this wasn't just about vengeance. This was about fixing a broken system. After a long pause, Nathaniel exhaled. I'll be expecting updates on this investigation. He turned to Gloria, his expression unreadable. I hope you take the time to reflect on the weight of your actions. Because this? He gestured toward Zara. This should have never happened. Gloria swallowed, her face blank. Zara wasn't sure if she was absorbing the weight of his words or just waiting for it all to be over. Finally, Nathaniel stood. Come on, Zara. She followed him out of the office. But not before stealing one last glance at Gloria. She wasn't sure what she had expected to feel: triumph, satisfaction, closure? Instead, she just felt tired. As they stepped back into the terminal, Zara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her father glanced down at her. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though part of her still felt the weight of the day on her chest. She hesitated. "What happens now?" Nathaniel considered this. Then, after a moment, he said, "We make sure this never happens again." And just like that, a battle had begun. Not just for Zara, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Zara could have let it end there. She could have accepted the apology, let her father handle things behind closed doors, and moved on like it was just another unfortunate event in a world that had long been unfair. She could have let time dull the sting of humiliation. Let the whispers at the airport fade into memory. Let Gloria's name become nothing more than a bitter afterthought. But she couldn't, because what happened to her had already happened to others, and if nothing changed, it would keep happening. Zara lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of that moment at the gate. The ripping of the ticket, a sound she would never forget. The way Gloria had dismissed her without a second thought. The weight of strangers' eyes on her, some filled with pity, others with quiet approval. The way she had felt small, like she had no power, no voice. But she wasn't small, and she had a voice. The next morning, she made a decision. She would not be just another victim. She would fight back, not with anger, with change. The first step. Over breakfast, she sat across from her father, her hands gripping a cup of tea that had long gone cold. "I want to do something," she said, her voice steady. "Not just for me, for everyone." Nathaniel studied her, his sharp businessman's mind already dissecting the determination in her voice. "What are you thinking?" Zara took a breath. "Training. Real training. Not just a video employees watch once and forget. Something immersive. Something that makes people see what they're doing. Makes them question themselves before they act. I want to help create a program that actually changes how people think." Nathaniel sat back, thoughtful. "That's ambitious." "I know." He nodded, a glimmer of approval in his eyes. "Good." And just like that, the fight had begun. Building the plan. Zara spent the next few weeks doing something she never thought she'd be doing at 16. Sitting in meetings. Drafting proposals. Learning how to make people listen. She reached out to the people she had met at the leadership conference. Those who had spent years studying bias, discrimination, and corporate reform. They shared research, helped her structure ideas, and provided her with the language she needed to convince those in power that this wasn't just a good idea, it was necessary. Meanwhile, her father paved the way. He arranged meetings with airline executives, connected her with board members who had the power to make real policy changes, and used his influence to ensure they took her seriously. And they did. At first, there was skepticism. Some board members believed it was an isolated incident, that firing Gloria had been enough. Zara didn't let them dismiss her. She walked into the conference room where the decision-makers sat, men and women who controlled everything, and she spoke. She told them what it felt like to be dismissed, to be humiliated, to be made to feel like she didn't belong. She told them, this wasn't just about her. It was about every passenger who had been treated unfairly. It was about every employee who had let their biases dictate their behavior. And most importantly, it was about the future of the airline. Did they really want to be the company that made the news for all the wrong reasons? Did they want to be the next scandal? The next viral clip of an employee mistreating a passenger? Or did they want to lead the industry in making air travel safer, fairer, better for everyone? She made them see it. And when she was done, they voted. A victory, but not the end. When the board members raised their hands in favor of implementing the program, Zara felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just relief. It wasn't just pride. It was purpose. But she knew this was just the beginning. Now, she had to make sure the training actually worked. That it wasn't just a corporate formality, but something that would change the way people saw the world. She worked alongside educators, psychologists, and activists, shaping a program that went beyond the surface. It wasn't just about telling people not to discriminate. It was about making them understand why they did it in the first place. And then teaching them how to unlearn it. The first test. Months later, the first group of employees went through the program. Zara sat in the back of the room, watching as flight attendants, gate agents, and supervisors listened, participated, learned. Some of them were resistant. Some thought they didn't need it. But then, something incredible happened. One woman, an older flight attendant, one of the first to complete the program, walked up to Zara after a session. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "For what?" Zara asked. "For making me see something I never wanted to admit," the woman said softly. "I've worked in this industry for years. I thought I treated everyone the same. But after this training, I realized I haven't. And now, I want to do better." Zara's throat tightened, because in that moment, she knew this was working. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't fix everything overnight. But it was a start. A spark. And if nurtured, sparks become flames. Join the movement. Zara's story isn't just hers. It's the story of anyone who has ever been treated as less than. It's the story of every person who has ever been dismissed, overlooked, or humiliated because of someone else's prejudice. But it's also a story of hope. A story of change. And it's just the beginning. If you believe in Zara's fight, if you believe in a world where no one should feel like they don't belong, let her know. Leave a comment. Share this story. Support the change she's making. Because sometimes, all it takes is one voice to start a revolution. And today, that voice is hers. The decision had been made. The airline's board had approved the initiative. But Zara knew the real battle was just beginning. It wasn't enough to have a plan. It had to be powerful. It had to be unforgettable. It had to change minds. Because what was the point of policies if people didn't believe in them? If a rule was just words on a page, it would be ignored. If training was just another checkbox, people would sit through it without really learning anything. And if nothing really changed, then it was all for nothing. Zara refused to let that happen. So, with a fire in her chest and a purpose bigger than herself, she set out to build something that would actually make a difference. Step 1. Finding the right people. She couldn't do it alone. She needed experts, people who had dedicated their lives to studying bias, discrimination, and systemic injustice. So she called them. One by one, she reached out to the people she had met at the leadership conference. The girl who had told her she wanted to become an activist for corporate accountability. The boy who dreamed of reforming education so that schools actually taught the truth about discrimination. The woman who had given a speech about bias training and its failures, about how so many corporations made training just a PR move instead of something real. Zara explained what had happened to her. How she had stood at the gate, just wanting to go home, only to be humiliated in front of strangers. How she had watched a flight attendant tear up her ticket like it meant nothing, like she meant nothing. And how, in that moment, she had made a choice. She would not let it be just another story. She would turn it into something bigger. She would make sure it never happened again. One by one, they all said the same thing. "I'm in." Step 2. Making it real. Meetings started. Zoom calls stretched into hours. Research flooded in, case studies, statistics, real-world examples of bias in corporate spaces. Zara read until her eyes ached. She didn't just want a training program. She wanted something that would force people to face themselves. She wanted airline employees, from flight attendants to executives, to see what they might have never realized. That bias isn't always loud. It's not always screaming slurs. Sometimes, it's quiet. It's assuming someone doesn't belong. It's looking at a name and making a judgment. It's treating one passenger with warmth and another with suspicion, without even realizing why. That was what needed to change. And change, real change, had to start from within. Step 3. Fighting the resistance. Not everyone was ready. When Zara and her team presented the first draft of their training program, some executives were hesitant. "Won't this make employees defensive?" one of them asked. "We don't want to offend anyone," another added. Zara felt rage rise in her throat. But she swallowed it down. Because she knew the truth. People who were comfortable with the way things were didn't want change. But that was exactly why it was necessary. She took a breath, locked eyes with the man who had spoken, and said, "If we're afraid to have this conversation, then we're admitting the problem is too big to ignore." Silence. Then, slowly, the head of HR, a woman who had been listening quietly, nodded. "She's right," she said. "If we avoid this, we're part of the problem." And just like that, the first wall began to crack. Step 4. The first trial. Months passed. The training program was finally ready for its first real test. A group of airline employees, flight attendants, gate agents, security staff, were invited to participate in the pilot program. Zara watched from the back of the room, her hands clenched into fists. Would they take it seriously? Would they roll their eyes? Dismiss it like another corporate lecture? Or, would something click? The session started. They listened. And then, something happened. One of the employees, a veteran flight attendant, a woman in her 50s, raised her hand. I think I've done this before, she admitted, her voice hesitant. The room went silent. What do you mean? The instructor asked. The woman swallowed hard. I think I've done what Gloria did. Zara's breath caught. I've made judgments about passengers without realizing it. The woman continued. Her voice cracked. I thought I was just being cautious. But maybe I wasn't being fair. Zara's chest tightened. This was why she had fought for this. Because if just one person saw their own bias, if just one person changed, then she had done something real. The turning point. The airline expanded the program. More employees went through the training. And one by one, the walls that had stood for so long began to crumble. Zara wasn't naive. She knew this wouldn't fix everything overnight. She knew there would still be people like Gloria. But she also knew there were people willing to change. And that was enough. Because sparks become flames. And flames can change the world. Now, it's your turn. Zara started this fight for herself. But now, it's for all of us. For every person who has been dismissed. For every person who has been treated like they don't belong. For every person who has been told, in 1,000 subtle ways, that they are less. But they are not. You are not. And if you believe that the world should be fairer, that people should be treated with respect no matter their name, their skin color, their background, then let Zara know. Leave a comment. Tell her you stand with her. Because sometimes, all it takes is one voice to start a revolution. And today, that voice is hers. Zara had never been in a boardroom like this before. The room was too big. The walls too white. The table too long. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but now that she was here, she felt small. Across from her sat the board of directors. The men and women who decided the fate of the airline. Some were listening intently. Others flipped through the printed proposal without really looking at it. A few leaned back in their chairs. Their faces unreadable. Her father sat beside her, not as Nathaniel Pierce, the CEO, the powerful businessman, the man everyone feared to disappoint, but as her father. And even though he could have presented this for her, he didn't, because this wasn't his fight. It was hers. She took a breath, feeling the weight of everything she had been through settle in her chest. And then, she spoke. The proposal that was more than words. This is more than just a policy change. She began, her voice steady. This is about making sure that what happened to me never happens again, not to me. Not to anyone. She didn't read from the script. She didn't rely on statistics or corporate jargon. She told them the truth. She told them what it felt like to be dismissed like she didn't belong. To be treated like a fraud. To have her voice ignored. To be made to feel like her presence was a problem. She saw some of the board members shift in their seats. Good. They should feel uncomfortable. Because she wasn't here to make them feel safe. She was here to make them see. She laid out her plan. The training program that would force employees to confront their biases. To recognize the way they treated passengers differently without even realizing it. This isn't about punishing people, she said. This is about making them better. The room was silent when she finished. Her heart pounded in her chest. And then, the questions came. The resistance she expected. How do we know this will work? What if employees push back? We don't want to create unnecessary tension in the workplace. Zara expected this. She had heard it before. From people who didn't want to admit there was a problem. But she didn't flinch. She stood taller. If we're afraid of talking about discrimination, she said, then we're admitting it's too big to ignore. A flicker of something shifted in the room. Some of them were starting to get it. But then, a man in the corner, older, wealthier, detached from the world outside his boardroom, leaned forward. I sympathize with what happened to you, he said, his voice smooth, calculated. But is this really a company problem? We already have policies in place for this. Zara met his gaze. And then, she told him the truth. The truth they couldn't ignore. Policies don't change people, she said. She let that sink in. You can write down all the rules you want. But rules don't stop people from making split-second judgments about passengers. They don't stop someone from looking at me and assuming I don't belong. They don't stop someone from seeing my name and making up a story about me in their head. You think policies are enough? Tell that to the flight attendant who ripped up my ticket. The room was so quiet she could hear the faint buzz of the air conditioning. And then, a woman across the table, a senior board member, nodded. She had felt it too. She had seen it happen. And in that moment, Zara knew she had won her over. The vote that changed everything. The chair of the board cleared his throat. We'll put it to a vote. Zara held her breath. And one by one, hands went up. Some hesitated, some didn't. But by the time the last hand was raised, it was clear. The motion had passed. The airline would implement the training program company-wide. Zara exhaled. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, a quiet sign of pride. And even though she had won this battle, she knew this was only the beginning. Why this matters? Zara walked out of that boardroom with more than just a victory. She walked out knowing that for every passenger who had ever been judged before they even spoke, change was coming. For every person who had been dismissed, ignored, treated like they didn't belong, change was coming. But she didn't do this alone. She did it because people believed in her. Because her father stood beside her. Because her friends supported her. Because people spoke up. And now, it's your turn. Stand with Zara. Her fight isn't over. The work isn't done. This isn't just her story. This is our story. Because bias exists everywhere. Because injustice doesn't go away on its own. Because if we don't fight for change, who will? If you believe in Zara's fight, if you believe that no one should ever feel like they don't belong just because of someone else's prejudice, leave a comment. Let Zara know you stand with her. Because sometimes, all it takes is one voice to start a movement. And today, that voice is yours. The training program was no longer an idea on paper. It was real. And for the first time, Zara saw its effects unfolding before her eyes. The airline had launched its first wave of training sessions, inviting flight attendants, gate agents, security staff, and corporate employees to participate. Zara had spent months fighting for this moment, but now that it was happening, a new fear crept in. Would it actually work? Would the employees care? Or would they roll their eyes, sit through the program like it was just another corporate requirement, and leave unchanged? She wasn't sure, but she had come too far to turn back now. So, she did the only thing she could. She watched. The first training session, a moment of change. The first training session was held in a large conference room at the airline's headquarters. Rows of employees sat at long tables, some leaning forward with curiosity, others sitting stiffly, arms crossed, waiting for it to be over. A massive screen at the front displayed a slide. Understanding bias. Seeing what we don't want to see. Zara sat in the back, her hands clenched in her lap. She had helped write those words. But would anyone hear them? The session began with a simple exercise. Employees were shown images of passengers, men, women, children, all from different backgrounds, dressed in different ways. The facilitator asked a question. Which one do you think is most likely to cause trouble on a flight? At first, no one wanted to answer. Zara could feel the hesitation in the room, the discomfort. But then, slowly, hands went up. Some pointed to a man wearing a hoodie. Others picked an older woman with a stern expression. A few hesitated before selecting a young man with dark skin and a duffel bag. And that's when the discussion began. Breaking the silence. The moment they understood. The facilitator didn't shame anyone. She simply asked, why? Why did they make those assumptions? What stories had they created in their minds about those passengers? What had they been taught, by society, by experience, by unconscious bias, that made them judge someone before they even spoke? The room was silent. Then, a flight attendant, an older woman who had been with the airline for 20 years, spoke. She hesitated, then said softly, I think I've done this before. Heads turned toward her. Zara held her breath. What do you mean? The facilitator asked gently. The woman exhaled, staring at her hands. I think I've treated passengers differently without realizing it. She admitted. I thought I was just being cautious. But now, I'm wondering if I was just being biased. Zara's heart clenched. Because that was it. That was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment someone saw it in themselves. Not because they were forced to. Not because they were shamed, but because they realized it on their own. And realization? That's where change begins. A ripple effect. The stories that followed. As the sessions continued, more employees began to open up. A gate agent admitted that he had always been stricter with certain passengers. Without really knowing why, a security officer confessed that he had pulled aside certain travelers more often than others, even when there was no real reason to. A flight attendant told a story about a man she had once refused to believe was in first class, only to realize later that he was one of the airline's highest-paying customers. One by one, the stories came out. One by one, the employees began to see. And Zara watched it all happen. She saw walls come down. She saw people look inward, questioning things they had never questioned before. She saw what real change looked like. And it was beautiful. What it meant. The moment of validation. Weeks later, Zara received an email. It was from a young flight attendant who had just completed the training. The subject line read, "Thank you." Zara opened it, her hands shaking. The message read, "Zara, I don't know if you remember me, but I was in one of the training sessions. I wanted to reach out because something happened to me yesterday. And I thought of you. There was a young woman at my gate, traveling alone. She looked nervous. A few months ago, I think I would have just brushed her off or assumed she didn't know what she was doing. But this time, I stopped. I actually saw her. She had the wrong boarding pass. Before, I might have thought she was trying to get on the wrong flight. But instead of assuming, I asked. Turns out, the airline had printed the wrong gate number on her ticket. I helped her fix it. I made sure she got where she needed to go. And the look of relief on her face, I'll never forget it. That might seem small, but to me, it was everything, because I don't know if I would have done that before your training. So thank you. You made me better." Zara stared at the screen, tears pooling in her eyes. She read the email again, and again, and again, and with each word, she felt something shift inside her. Because for the first time, she knew she had changed something, not just for herself, not just for one person, but for everyone who would be treated differently because of what she had done. And that was everything. Now, it's your turn. Zara's story isn't just hers. It's yours, too. Because change starts with people who care. With people who choose to see. With people who choose to be better. And that's where you come in. If you believe in what Zara is doing, if you believe in a world where everyone is treated with fairness and dignity, leave a comment. Tell Zara you stand with her. Tell her that you believe in change. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person to start something real. And today, that person is you. Zara sat on the balcony of her family's home, staring at the city lights stretching far beyond the horizon. The world felt different now. Months had passed since the first training session. Since then, the program had been fully implemented across the airline. Thousands of employees had gone through it. Reports showed a significant drop in passenger complaints related to bias and discrimination. Her father had even forwarded her a letter from a customer, someone she had never met, who wrote about how, for the first time in years, they had felt respected while traveling. Zara should have felt satisfied. She had won, hadn't she? But deep inside, she knew the truth. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The realization that changed everything. One night, she sat across from her father in his study. He had spent the last hour going over company reports and market trends. But Zara wasn't thinking about airlines. She was thinking about something bigger. "Dad," she finally said, her voice steady, "I don't think I can stop here." He set his papers down and studied her. "Tell me what you're thinking." Zara took a deep breath. "I started this because of what happened to me. Because of one moment that felt so unfair. So humiliating. So wrong, and I wanted to fix it." She paused. "But what I've realized is that, this isn't just about airlines." Her father nodded, urging her to continue. "This happens everywhere," she said. "In schools. In workplaces. In hospitals. In boardrooms. There are people everywhere who are judged before they even speak. And not everyone has the privilege of fighting back like I did." She leaned forward, her hands clasped together. "I don't just want to change one company. I want to change the way the world sees people." Nathaniel Pierce smiled, not the businessman's smile he showed in boardrooms, but the father's smile he reserved for moments like this. "I wondered when you'd say that," he said softly. Zara blinked. "You knew?" He nodded. "I've watched you grow through this. And I knew that once you started this fight, you wouldn't stop. Because you're not just reacting to what happened to you. You're thinking about everyone else. That's what real leaders do. His words settled deep inside her. And at that moment, Zara made her decision. A new path. Turning a moment into a movement. Zara spent the next few weeks thinking about the future. She had always assumed she would follow a traditional path, go to college. Maybe study business, step into the corporate world like her father. But now, she wanted more than just success. She wanted impact. So she started researching organizations that specialized in social impact, corporate responsibility, and policy reform. She reached out to her contacts from the leadership conference. She asked questions, listened, learned. She didn't just want to talk about change. She wanted to build it. And slowly, an idea began to form. The birth of something bigger. One evening, she sat with her parents at the dinner table. "I'm going to start something of my own," she announced. Her mother looked up, intrigued. "Start what, sweetheart?" Zara set down her fork, her eyes bright with determination. "A foundation, a program, something that goes beyond just airlines. I want to create a platform that helps companies, schools, and even government offices implement real diversity and bias training." Her parents exchanged a look, one of pride. "That's a big dream," her father said. "I know. It won't be easy. I know that too." He smiled. "Then let's get to work." The journey begins. With the support of her parents, her mentors, and the people who had believed in her from the start, Zara launched her initiative. She called it See Change, See, Empathize, Evolve. It started as a small project, focusing on corporations that wanted real change in their company culture. Then schools started reaching out. Then nonprofit organizations. Then government agencies. People were listening. And soon, See Change became more than just a program. It became a movement, a call to action. How you can be part of this. Zara's story isn't just her story. It's yours. It's for anyone who has ever been judged before they even spoke. For anyone who has ever been told they don't belong. For anyone who has been treated as less than because of the color of their skin, their background, their name, or their circumstances. And now, it's time to take action. You don't have to be powerful to make a difference. You don't have to be rich. You don't have to be famous. All you have to do is see people for who they really are. Speak up when you see injustice. Educate yourself and others. Refuse to accept bias as just the way things are. Be part of the change. Join the movement. If Zara's story inspired you, if you believe in the power of one voice, one action, one person standing up to make a difference, then show your support. Leave a comment. Tell Zara that you stand with her. Tell her what part of this story resonated with you. Tell her what changes you want to see in the world. Hit the like button, because every like helps spread this message further. Subscribe to the channel, because this isn't just one story. This is a movement.